Those who forget the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. Welcome to the Indiana Jones universe, the podcast that explores the incredible adventures of the world's greatest globe-trotting archaeologist, Indiana Jones. Each episode is a casual and somewhat humorous, opinionated conversation with a slightly sophisticated analytical study of the expanded universe content from the Indiana Jones franchise. You can expect to find discussions about the adventures of young Indiana Jones, the further adventures of Indiana Jones comic books, the Staff of Kings and Emperor's Tomb video games, the Indiana Jones novels, the original soundtracks, and so much more. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Indiana Jones Universe podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and today we are extremely excited to continue our interview series for Young Indiana Jones, which includes behind-the-scenes conversations with some of the talented filmmakers who contributed to this extraordinary and ambitious television series. Today, our special guest is an exceptionally talented British playwright, screenwriter, and film director. He received 2 Academy Award nominations for Best Adapted Screenplay as a result of his brilliant work with Stephen Daldry on his film The Hours, starring Nicole Kidman and Meryl Streep, and also The Reader, starring Ralph Fiennes and Kate Winslet. He has also written screenplays for television and has had an extensive career in theater, directing numerous stage plays, for which he has received 8 Laurence Olivier Award nominations. In addition to all of these accolades, he is also responsible for directing an extraordinary episode of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, Paris 1919. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our very special guest today, Mr. David Hare. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So let's just get started right from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and how did your film career begin, and how did that ultimately lead to your role on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles?
Oh, goodness. I was a playwright, and I wrote a film for television. And a very brilliant producer, David Rose, who later became the head of Channel 4, was at the BBC, and he read my script, my screenplay for the BBC. And when I read it, I said, there's only one problem. I have to direct it myself. He didn't look remotely concerned. He just said, fine, and you direct it. And so I walked onto a set, and at the end of the first day's filming, I said to the cameraman, I have to tell you, that was my first day as a filmmaker. He said it didn't show at all. So then in the 1980s, I, like a lot of film directors in Britain, Stephen Frears, Michael Apted, Mike Newell, we all graduated from television and started making feature films because thanks to the enlightened policy of Channel 4, we were financed to make films that would first of all be in cinemas and then later be shown on television. And so I made 3 films as a director, writer-director in the 1980s. And the third of them, Strapless, was produced by Rick McCallum.
Oh, wow.
Who was immensely good fun to work with and who was full of a sort of tremendous go-getting energy that I very much responded to. It's not something you have a lot of in England. We're more laid back. And Rick is an enthusiast, and he goes for it big time. And we got on terribly well, both on Strapless and then on a television film that I made called Heading Home, which was shown on the BBC. And so when he did the Indiana Chronicles, he was forever asking me either to write or direct them because we got on so well together before.
That's terrific. And yeah, before production began, what were your initial conversations like with George Lucas and Rick McCallum, and how well did your creative vision align with their ideas?
I think it's probably, look, you have to realize that, most of my life is spent either directing my own material. You say I've directed other people. I have a little, but mostly I've directed my own work. The films for which I'm known, particularly at that period, were the films that I'd written myself. I wrote plays which I directed myself through the 1980s. And so for me, to pick up a script by somebody else for a television project was something I had never done before. And I did it only because Rick asked me to. I had just finished writing something and I thought it would be a nice holiday to go to Prague and work on some material which was more in the hands of the producer, perhaps. I'm normally responsible for everything. It's really my film, and all my films were, as it were, authored by me. But here was something where I was going to shoot film for somebody else, namely for George Lucas. And so that idea of it being as near to the old-fashioned studio system as it gets, I found that quite freeing, and I rather look forward to it. For me, it was like time off. But what you must understand about Indiana Jones is that George is supremely 100% in charge, and so it's his creation, it's his series. And what you're really doing is something which old-fashioned 30s movie directors used to do, which is that you're shooting a lot of film and you're sending it back. In this case, you're sending it back to the ranch in California. And basically, it's being edited by George. It's not being edited by the director. It's all being edited under George's supervision. And in fact, the editing of the film happened in my absence. And then at a certain point, George flew me over, and we have a week in which we argue and discuss and talk about the way it's turned out. But the hand that is on it is primarily the producers. And this is very, very unusual because that's how films used to be made by Selznick and people like that. And George is like that. It's his baby. It's not yours. You're a hired hand, just like the director of photography is a hired hand or the art director is a hired hand. And for me, that was quite liberating. I rather enjoyed it.
Yeah, and the original concept for this series was sort of to use it as this teaching tool to educate students about historical events. So, therefore, for this series, how did you try to create compelling drama from historical fact?
Well, I think probably, and there were moments of where George saw it one way and I saw it another, because really, I, I was pretty uninterested in the character of Indiana Jones. I mean, you're talking about Versailles. This is 1919, and the episode concerns the conference at which a settlement is made about the future of Europe. And out of that settlement grows a grievance among the Germans that they have been cheated and they have been turned, an honorable war, as they saw it, has been turned into a humiliating defeat by the Treaty of Versailles. And out of the grievance that the German people had about that treaty grew Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party, the revolution in Germany in the late 20s and 30s, and eventually the Second World War and the Holocaust. It all grows out of that treaty. And that is the origin. And so you have there a series of fascinating people, international statesmen, attendees like Ho Chi Minh and Gertrude Bell, people like that, all sorts of people in various functions, all brought together. And to me, that was the fascination of it. I wasn't so deeply interested, to be honest, in Indiana Jones. Particularly, Indiana Jones to me was just the sounding board, the means by which we would talk about something that was, to me, a great deal more interesting than Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
And so if there was a source of tension between, well, there were various interesting arguments with George, tremendously entertaining man to have an argument with. There's no unkindness or malice or unpleasantness with George. He's such a genial, decent, interesting person that having artistic arguments with him is great fun. because he never lets it get personal, and it's always about the work, and he's perfectly open to having arguments about the work.
Wow.
But I did get messages saying, "Hang on, we need more on Indiana Jones." To which I would kind of say, "Well, Indiana Jones is just a witness to the historical events.
Right.
It's the historical events that are interesting." And Sean Patrick Flannery is not, he was a young actor. He wasn't, as you might say, the most fascinating or complex young actor, and so there wasn't a huge amount that I could do to make his part more interesting. And so I think eventually, though I may be wrong about this, that after I had shot and we had edited the episode, I think George went back and got some more shots of Indiana Jones, because he just said, where's Indiana Jones? The series is called Young Indy. Where is Young Indy?
And another thing George wanted to do with this series too is experiment with new digital filmmaking techniques. And as a director, what challenges and benefits came from taking this approach?
Oh, I think this was just the beginning of the new, first of all, you've got this incredible state of the art, as it then was, sound facility at the ranch. I mean, George's sound studio was the best in the world. And so playing with the bells and whistles there is immense fun for a filmmaker in the early 1990s, because you're basically being given this first class orchestra to play with, that is it's exhilarating and exciting, and in the same way, yeah, there was just the beginning of digital work, and it was, for me, it was very freeing. I'm a serious minded filmmaker, and I've always got total responsibility for everything. And suddenly I was allowed to become quite irresponsible, because ultimately it was not my project. I was just serving the project. And so, because of that, with the help of David Tattersall, I think we shot it in quite a free and easygoing way.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, the cinematography was amazing in this episode. And, one of the things as well is, Indiana Jones has a certain visual tone. And what are the kinds of things you pay attention to as a director to fit into that tone? And does that ever come into conflict with your own personal style?
I don't think with this particular material that it did. I think my unique contribution, and I can talk about this because this really is the heart of my relationship with Lucasfilm. My unique contribution was the actors. I come from a theatre background. So to me, if you've got Cyril Cusack and you've got Anna Massey and you've got Michael Maloney and you've got Joseph Summer and you've got Michael Kitchen and you've got Doug Henschel, you've got Jerome Crabbe, for God's sake. Denis O'Hare is going to become one of the leading actors one day on Broadway, and there he is in a tiny part. And this is an amazing ensemble of actors. And so, to me, it's an immense privilege to work with these kind of actors who you don't normally see on television at that point in the 1990s, I should say. None of them were familiar faces on television at all. They're all, tremendous film or theatre actors. And we were all out there in Prague, and I was shooting them. And when I'm used to working with the greatest actors in the world. That's what I do, and that's what Rick, wanted from me. And when I got back and saw on the ranch the version that George had cut, I said, "You cannot, George, cut away in the middle of a line. It's just so rude. It's so rude for the actor." And my George said to me, "What do you mean rude for the actor?" Like, this was a concept that had never occurred to him.
Wow.
And I said, "Look, if an actor says a line as brilliantly as, say, Cyril Cusack says a line, you stay with him and you get to the end of the line with him. Then you cut. You don't need to be pushing the story on. You have to allow the audience in and to enjoy the benefits of really good actors doing their work." And I could see that this puzzled him, and that he didn't necessarily, that wasn't how he thought. And in fact, what grew out of this, and I suppose this proves what I'm saying, is that when he came to do what I would call Star Wars 4, but I believe it's called Star Wars 1, is that right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure about the order. But both on Star Wars 4 and 5, he asked me to write them, which was great, very kind of him. But he didn't just want me to write them, he wanted me to co-direct them with him.
Wow.
I said, why do you want me to co-direct? He said, well, you're very interested in acting, and I'm not so interested in acting. And he said, and I thought you could do the shot. I could do the shots, George said, and you could do the acting.
Wow.
And I said, I can't quite see that arrangement working, really, George. I don't see 14 weeks in Morocco with you setting up the shot and then me directing the actors. I don't kind of think that's a collaboration that's made in heaven. Because, we have such different approaches as filmmakers.
Yeah.
I hasten to say that his approach is, probably 100 or 1,000 times more successful commercially than mine. But we really approach material very, very differently, he and I. And so I must admit, I refused that job of co-directing. Later, one of the actors, I shall not name whom, but you would know the household name, played the lead, said to me, Jesus, David, we could have done with you. I think George, in his own, I'm not telling the story remotely against George, but I think George was not known to be, as they say, an actor's director. What George is interested in is story, and what he's brilliant at is story and driving story forward. He's also interested in archetype. He's read an awful lot of Joseph Campbell, and he knows about the archetypes of the story, and that he works to that, and that's his interest. Whereas I must admit, I'd never read Joseph Campbell before I went to the ranch, and I read it to try and understand the mind of the man I was working for.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting to hear more about your collaboration with George Lucas and those sort of contrasting styles of filmmaking. Now let's talk a little bit about your episode, Paris 1919, in a little bit more detail. Obviously, you've had a successful career as a writer and as a playwright. So, what was your initial reaction to the script that Jonathan Hales created for this episode?
Oh, well, I thought he had an almost impossible task, which is, this is one of the great junctions of history, and he's got to do it in 50 minutes, and he's got to do it in the presence of Indiana Jones. So I thought he'd done a very good job of putting the stuff together. I think we did rework it a little. I don't remember in great detail exactly how that process worked, but I think Rick was inviting me to be free, and I think there was also a moment. Jonathan was not on set when I work as a writer on the movies. You mentioned my work with Stephen Daldry. Well, Stephen Daldry always wants me there on set, because when you see a scene rehearsed, you're able to understand it much better and you're able to make improvements in it. And I think when you've got actors of that caliber, if you've got Joseph Summer or you've got Anna Massey, the likelihood is they're going to make suggestions and say, look, it would be better if we did this or better if we did that. So I think a certain amount was moved around. And then George in the editing, again, moved an awful lot around, so that some of it was not really recognizable in the order of the script. And so, what I was handed was a very good template for condensing those events in a way that exactly what George wanted, that it should be educational and understood by people who didn't know anything of the history of the period.
Yeah, and the episode begins with this incredible sort of documentary newsreel that illustrates sort of how the end of the war has affected all of the colonial powers in Europe, while also introducing us to, of course, the topic of this episode in the Paris Peace Conference. How much of this footage was actually from World War I, and then how much of it was actually footage that you shot specifically for the episode?
I had nothing to do with that opening. George's work, not mine. And that intermingling of the real footage of Versailles in 1919 and with my actors, that was very good. But I think, to be fair, it was also a tribute to all the various departments, i.e. the costume and cinematography and setting and everything. It was absolutely seamless when you go from historical reality to our recreation of it. Frankly, the cracks don't show. That's why we were in Czechoslovakia, was because in Czechoslovakia we could get something that approximated Versailles, which is after all uniquely spectacular, that I do remember banging on about at great length and saying, if we can't do this on the scale that makes it convincing, I am not going to shoot this in the town hall and, make it just look like amateur theatricals. It has to have scale. And everything I was doing all the time was to try and increase the scale. And, there are an awful lot of big public settings in it because I was trying to let as much historical sweep into it as I could possibly get. And obviously, it was an extraordinary moment. We were doing it, whatever it was, 92, was it, or 93? I'm not sure. But, the wall had only recently fallen. There we were in Prague. Prague was not the huge tourist center that it became by the end of the century. It was still a place that was very marked by austerity and communism and deprivation and poverty, with very, very naturally beautiful settings. And we were getting them on film really for the first time in Western films, because they were not the familiar places where you shoot films. The railway stations and the Versailles places and the hotels and all that, they're all new to film. So the images are ravishing because they haven't been on in the movies before, not in Western movies before.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the scale of it is totally, I think, captured incredibly well. And one thing that we talked a little bit about earlier was sort of Indiana Jones being such a passive character in this episode, which, totally contrasts his typical role in this series as this, heroic adventurer. I mean, he's simply, watching history unfold, right in front of his eyes, which is so compelling. But what was it like working with Sean Patrick Flannery in this episode?
Well, as I say, I probably didn't work with him enough, did I? I mean, I'd enjoyed the Indiana Jones movies, particularly the one with Sean Connery. I don't know which that one is, the third one. And that was really good because I think that probably it was rewritten. I know it was rewritten by a playwright. And, that dialogue between Sean Connery and Harrison Ford is absolutely fantastic. But that is what I'd call playwright's dialogue. It's really classy playwright's dialogue. But, I'm sorry, in this episode, poor Indiana Jones had to be a functionary. And so he didn't really feature much in my thinking. And, if maybe it's my failing, maybe I should have pulled him in more and tried to do something that, gave Indiana Jones a real function. But it wasn't there in the script. It wasn't there in history. And probably, I'm sorry, but with those actors, with the great actors I was working with, I was like a kid in a sweet shop with all those interesting, sweets to eat.
Well, speaking about some of those great actors, towards the beginning of the episode, Indy reunites with T.E. Lawrence, who he met as a young boy in Egypt in an earlier episode. What was it like working with Douglas Henshaw to bring this historical figure to life?
Oh, he's tremendous, Dougie. And I think that he completely, all we talked about, obviously, was how you avoid the cliche of, and not the cliche, but because it was obviously a magnificent performance, but how you don't seem like Peter O'Toole and how you avoid what it is that Peter O'Toole did with the part.
Right.
And I think Dougie gives it a kind of buccaneering good humor that is more charming and attractive, probably, than O'Toole's slightly frosty intensity. And I suspect that's probably closer to how T.E. Lawrence was. And so I thought he was wonderful in it.
Oh, he was absolutely terrific, and he appears in another episode too, in 1917 in Palestine, which is another great episode. And one of the things that I think though is so fantastic is the production design. It creates such a strong sense of authenticity. Was this episode actually shot in Paris? And if not, do you have any behind the scenes stories to share about the locations or sets for this episode?
No, no, no. It's all shot in Prague and in Brno and then in Carlsbad, or Kalovivari, as the Czechs call it. So what I'm saying is, in order to reach back into the physical imagery of 1919, it was necessary to go to a communist country or a country that had recently been freed from communism. And the fabric of the buildings and the feeling of the streets and the look of the place took you back to 1919. And that's what I'm saying, because the wall had only just come down, that gave you the feeling of 1919. because we were lucky enough to capture that society before capitalism arrived and transformed it, and new buildings went up, and the streets lost their period feeling. And we were just terribly, we were filming in the right places, but we were herring around all over Czechoslovakia, as it then was, before it divided into the two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But it was still in the early 90s, Czechoslovakia. And we were racing around the whole of, at least three different, probably four different cities to get all those locations. And what I was talking about earlier, just to get that amount of production value on the screen, to convince you were there in 1919.
Yeah, it was tremendous, totally. And, some of those big master shots from up above of, when they're signing the Treaty of Versailles are just brilliant.
That's what I mean about being freed up. Perhaps when I was a feature film director in the 80s, I was quite focused down and closed down. My first film, Weatherby, which won the Golden Bear at Berlin, that film was claustrophobic, and a lot of it was shot in one location. And it had tremendous intensity, but it had very narrow focus. So the lovely thing about doing Indiana Jones was just the chance to go wide and go free and go big, which is something that as a filmmaker I'd never done. And again, Czechoslovakia was a cheap enough country for it to be possible to do this. I'm sure it was a hell of a sight cheaper to shoot that in Prague, but then, my God, to have gone to France and done that would have been way above the budget of any TV show.
And throughout this episode, there are numerous conversations between Arnold Toynbee and Gertrude Bell. And I'm curious, during scenes like this that have large amounts of dialogue, how does a director utilize cinematography to create a more engaging and visually interesting scene?
Well, that's what I've always done. And so, I'm used to films in which people talk. I'm sort of bored by films in which people don't talk. The very stupid thing that nearly everybody says is film is a visual medium. It's such a stupid thing to say, because actually, film is a medium in which the word and the image hit together. And when they hit together, then you get something sensational.
Yeah.
And the instance I always use is in Citizen Kane. Probably the most famous line in the history of the cinema is when the old man Bernstein sits back and he says, "I remember that day when on a lake, I crossed the lake, I saw a girl with a white parasol, and I only saw her for 5 seconds. But do you know, not a day has gone by since when I've not thought about that girl." Now, Orson Welles, who is the most ingenious and brilliant filmmaker of the time, does not cut to a flashback of a girl with a parasol. He knows it is not necessary to do that. He knows this dialogue is completely wonderful, and everyone in the audience will have that image and they will do it for themselves.
Right.
And so the whole art of filmmaking is to combine those moments where the word powers and those moments where the image powers. And films in which nobody says anything interesting are not worth the time of day. On the other hand, films where people just talk and there's no cinematic invention going on or cinematic imagination going on, they're equally boring. The Godfather, the dialogue is just 100% sensational, but then so is the cinematography. And that's over and over again. Brilliant words hit brilliant images.
Yeah, and that's a great sort of explanation of, this pairing between written dialogue and the moving image. And an example of that, I think, is during these scenes of the Paris Peace Conference, there's several monologues from Woodrow Wilson and George Clemenceau, and there's such a strong sense of realism in these characters. It feels so historically accurate. Did you have any specific instructions for how you wanted these scenes to be filmed, and what was your approach to working with these actors on the set?
There was a wonderful moment when I accidentally said to Joseph Summer something derogatory about Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson did not come out of Versailles terribly well, and he did not handle the situation very well. And Joseph really just suddenly said to me quite sharply, "I will not have that said about my character."
Wow.
And he meant it. He meant it. And he was right. It's absolutely wrong for a director to make value judgments of that kind about a character. And I sort of thought that everyone in history would accept that it wasn't Woodrow Wilson's finest hour. But, Joseph is in there batting for his man. And it was completely wrong of me to say that. And I was well rebuked.
Wow. I also think it's so interesting to see how well prepared all of these historical figures are. I've talked to so many directors and writers, and it sounds like everybody just really did their homework. They researched these people, and they knew who they were enough to say, this is how I think this person would have acted in this particular situation. Obviously, with the series being, based, somewhat in fiction, of course.
All the great film actors. You read. I was just reading Judi Dench, and Judi Dench said, "Of course, I know where my character was born, and of course, I know where she went to school, and of course, I know who her lovers were, and of course," she said, "but that's all the stuff you do at home. You don't bring that stuff into the rehearsal room because there's no need to discuss that stuff. That's called homework. And the homework that you do is the basis of your performance. But there's absolutely no need to sit discussing it with the other actors."
Yeah.
And, if you work with the greatest actors, as I have been lucky to do, people like Anthony Hopkins or Ralph Fiennes, they arrive on the set having done a huge amount of work, but they don't burden you with that work. They don't discuss that work with you because that's the work they're using to mold their imaginations. And every one of the actors, if you work with Anna Massey, she'll have read all the books about Gertrude Bell. She'll know exactly what she's doing. And that's the mark of the really great film actors. And the ones who turn up and say, "Oh, I'm just going to improvise today, and I don't know what my character's feeling, and I don't think," and the people who turn the set into a place where the homework has to be done, that is self-indulgence on a massive scale because 100 people are waiting around for you to do your homework. Why would you not arrive on the set prepared? It's shocking if you don't. And luckily, all the actors in this episode, as in most of the work that I do, all of them see that as a duty. You turn up and you don't waste the crew's time by doing your work in front of them. You do your work before you arrive, just as the crew have. David Tattersall turns up having lit the scene in his mind and knowing what it is, where he's going to put his lights and what he's going to do. And every decent person on a film set does.
Yeah, and it's so important too, as well, just for the quality of the picture to have that type of preparation. Now, when the German delegates arrive at the train station, they receive this fierce and unfavorable response from all the civilians nearby. How did you shoot all of these large crowd scenes, and what did you want to convey to the audience?
Well, in those situations, you're in the hands of a great first director, and the first assistant's the person who's doing that work for you and who has to understand what it is you want and how it looks through the camera, which is the crucial thing. Marshalling massive numbers of people and trying to concentrate on the center of what was going on. Everybody can do crowd scenes in the sense of making the screen full of activity, but the art of the great crowd scenes, and probably the greatest director of crowds of all time is Kurosawa. You watch any Kurosawa movie, there'll be 200 people in the shot, but he will tell you exactly where your eye is to go because he composes it so that he directs the eye to exactly what it is you should be looking at.
Right.
And that's what the great crowd directors do. And I'm sure what I was trying to do is concentrate on the action at the center and use everything else to add concentration and focus to the action at the center.
Now, during the final scene in this episode, when the Treaty of Versailles is actually signed, silence overwhelms the entire palace, and all you can hear are the sort of synchronized footsteps of the German delegates as they enter the room. What sort of tone did you want to create during this sort of significant moment of the Treaty of Versailles actually being signed?
Exactly what you're saying about its significance, that everything in European 20th century history stems from that moment. What we were trying to say was, yes, Clemenceau gets his way. he gets the treaty he wants, but the consequences of that treaty destroy Europe in the middle of the 20th century. And that's exactly, I wanted a sense of the incredible malice of that moment, how disastrous it was. And obviously, we can see that history learned from it. In other words, Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin at the end of the Second World War let Germany rebuild and did not let the same sense of grievance overwhelm the country and did not humiliate Germany. And that was because they had watched the result of humiliating Germany the time before.
Yeah, and there's one small moment actually that I'm now remembering from that scene, which always sort of stuck with me, where one of the German delegates, when he goes to sign the treaty, the pen doesn't work, or the ink of the fountain pen. Was that actually historically accurate, or was that something that?
I'm fairly sure that's exactly what happened. I seem to remember, Jonathan Hales, when I talk about people doing their homework, Jonathan Hales had done all the homework necessary, and I'm sure that's accurate.
Now, throughout this episode, Arnold Toynbee's sort of cynical attitude about the end of World War One, totally foreshadows what's going to happen in World War Two, and it totally contrasts, Indiana Jones's, optimistic expectations for Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. So, as a result, when you look at this episode in its totality, what theme did you want the audience to take away from this episode?
Oh, that exactly that view that I have a friend, the playwright Michael Frayn, and he always says, there are all these films and plays and TV series about the Nazis, but actually the reconstruction of Germany after World War II is almost as amazing a phenomenon as the Nazis themselves. Look how Germany dealt with the immensity of the crime of the murder of 6 million Jews, and look at the immensity of the crime of surrendering the country to a fascist lunatic who kills millions and millions and millions of people. And yet Germany manages somehow in the 50s and 60s to rebuild itself, but the other Western countries give it the freedom to rebuild itself. And that is the lesson of history. The lesson of history: allow a country to breathe when it's been defeated. And that's really what the episode is about.
Any other things you would like to mention about this episode that we haven't talked about, or just your experience working with George Lucas and Rick McCallum in general?
Well, look, I loved working with Rick, and Rick was the hands-on person, and George was the thinker back home. George's approach could not be more different than from mine, as I've tried to make clear. I could go into greater detail, but I don't need to. We're completely different kinds of filmmaker. He wants to say one thing at a time very clearly, whereas I revel in ambiguity and openness and leaving the audience to decide what the meaning of a scene is. George doesn't. George tells them what the scene's about. This is what's going to happen, he says, hence that famous line, I have a bad feeling about this. Then something happens, and then a couple of characters discuss what has happened. And so George holds your hand. And, there's no doubt that he's extremely brilliant at it. So what I always say is that he cuts quite a narrow furrow, but he cuts a very deep furrow. He doesn't like a scene sitting there for the audience to decide for themselves what they feel about it. Whereas I love that. I love that kind of openness. And so the struggle between the two of us was one kind of filmmaker against another kind of filmmaker. But as I say, God, he's a worthy person to argue with, because, he's a tremendous gentleman, and he's a first-rate leader of a company.
And did you have sort of any discussions with him or the post-production team after they had finished their sort of final edit of the episode?
I mean, I just sort of said I wouldn't have done it like this. I didn't feel passionately that they should have done it my way, because I knew from the very beginning I was a hired hand, and George was free to do whatever he wanted. And he would say he took the best of me, the things we've talked about today in terms of the scope and the breadth and the width and the brilliance of the acting. And he threw away the worst of me, which, from his point of view, is a wish to leave the audience to decide for themselves about things. It was an interesting time for me, and I just thoroughly enjoyed it. That's something I think that comes across. I hope is that it was a very, very enjoyable thing to work on. It was actually good fun. It really taught me a lot, actually.
Yeah, and as you reminisce about the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles nearly 30 years later, what did you take away from the experience, and what impact has the show had on you as a filmmaker and as a person?
I think that it freed me. I think that I stopped making films pretty soon after, mainly because I just didn't have time to be a playwright and to go on being a filmmaker. But when I went back to filmmaking, which was with what are called the Warwicker trilogy, the three films, the Page Eight, Assaulting the Battlefield, and Turks and Caicos, which have an absolutely incredible cast with Bill Nye and Rachel Weisz and Ralph Fiennes and Michael Gambon and Helena Bonham Carter, just the greatest actors of the time. I was incredibly free. I felt much less anxious as a filmmaker. I think that's because I felt technically much more in command than I had been when I made my feature films in the 80s. And I think that Young Indy was just a way to free me up. And I think that paid off when I made what we call the Warwicker trilogy, which is on Netflix for those of you who want to watch it.
Well, David, thank you so much for taking the time to come talk with me about this phenomenal television series and sharing so many great stories about your own process as a filmmaker and your style and your interest in this series. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to speak with you. So thank you so much for this.
And for me too. Thank you very much indeed.
And for all of you listening, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to our podcast, leave a review, tell other people what you think about the show. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, you can find us at www.theindianajonesuniverse.com. You can also email us there or join our community of indie fans and podcast listeners over on X. You can find us there at the Indie Universe. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Once again, I'm Will.
And I'm David Hare. And until next time, so long, Dr. Jones.